Hello everyone! This is the 6th of 10 videos I'm making on retro games. In case you're interested in checking out the previous entries before watching this one, I've left links on screen and in the description box below. I would advise playing Morrowind before watching this video, as I will be going in depth on the story, and even though I try to make it newcomer friendly, much of this essay's content can only be fully understood by playing the game. I'm AesirAesthetics, and this is Morrowind. In 2002, Bethesda launched Morrowind on the PC and the original Xbox. The game was a commercial hit and went on to garner various industry awards for excellence in presentation. It was a landmark RPG as well as a transformative title for the Elder Scrolls series, since it saw the team drop the procedurally generated maps of old in favor of hand placement. That increased the work effort to the degree that the collective time spent designing Morrowind was allegedly in the ballpark of 100 years. Regardless of that fact, during Morrowind's development it became apparent that even the already significantly reduced map size would still be too large. So instead of creating the entire Morrowind region, the team settled for the island of Vvardenfell. What the game sacrificed in size, it more than made up for in detail. I've spent the upper part of 300 hours putting this video together, and I'm still only going to be scratching the surface. The craftsmanship at display in this game is unprecedented even by today's standards. Sure, everything looks brown and jagged, but like all great games, there's more to Morrowind than meets the eye. In analyzing this game, I've delved into numerous interviews with the development team and tried to find what was at the heart of Morrowind. They seem to have changed their attitudes over the years, so I limited myself to interviews during the development and release of the game to find a satisfactory answer. I also reached out to the huge Morrowind community to find out what they thought was at the core of the game. Much to my delight, since I had already invested enormous time to this essay, I found a pretty consistent answer from both parties. What players and developers alike seem to universally agree on is that Morrowind is, in one way or another, centered on delivering an immersion-driven fantasy with an emphasis on freedom. I'm of the school of thought that the only fair critique is through the lens of what the work in question set out to accomplish and whether or not it succeeded, so my analytical lens in this video will be built on the foundation of Morrowind in its attempts to deliver an immersion-driven fantasy with an emphasis on freedom, and the design choices the developers made in order to reach that goal. In addition to front-loading my essay's core, I'll also make you a promise that in the end of this video, I'll be discussing something I'd like to see the industry learn from Morrowind going forwards. With the ground rules set, let's ease ourselves into the story. The exact story of the Elder Scrolls universe is long and mostly irrelevant to the discussion at hand, except to guarantee to you that it follows many staples of the creation myth as established by the monomyth. Since you're on the internet, I will assume that you're familiar with the hero's journey, and instead of boring you by discussing the details as it relates to the Elder Scrolls, I want to point out how it is the flexible ubiquity of the monomyth that makes it so very interesting. Maybe there is something to the fact that all cultures retold it to fit their geographies and understanding of the world, or maybe we humans are just limited in our scope of storytelling and just happen to retread the same ground. The monomyth might genuinely be something hardwired into our brains, or it may just be that someone took a vague and universal approach to interpreting myth and by design found that there were a lot of commonalities. The monomyth being present in this game is likely the result of a developer having read The Hero of a Thousand Faces and suggesting that since it was good enough to help design pen and paper RPG adventures back in the day, it should work fine for a video game. I'm not going to be using the monomyth as a means of presenting the story, since the exact story is a bit too complex for that framework. The expansive nature of the game and the freedom of the player do miraculously fall in line with the monomyth, and I decided to bring it up to quickly celebrate that achievement. But as for the discussion at hand, you need only know two things. First off, the story of Morrowind is actually 4 stories of exceptional individuals, those being Veloth, Nerevar, the Outlander, and the Nerevarine. By the end of this analysis, you may or may not agree that these are 4 individuals, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And secondly, that the history of Tamriel is dated in eras. The relevancy of lore in our discussion begins with an ancient prophet named Veloth. it is not until he appears in Tamriel history that the story of the game truly begins to take shape. Veloth was a Chimer born in the Somerset Isles during the Merethic era who led the construction of the Chimer culture. He led the way for the spiritual life of the Chimer, as it was by his hand that they abandoned the old elven gods in favor of worshipping the three good Taitra. He also taught his followers that the pure way of life was the right way of life, and it was by his ability to distinguish between good and evil that he gained notoriety. There are many speculations on the exact origins of Veloth's teachings and whether or not they were in fact his, or whether he and the Chimer were being played by larger forces, but whatever you choose to believe, it was undeniably the religious difference between the Chimer and the establishment that led to the Chimeri Exodus. In this exodus, the Chimer went from the Somerset Isles to Tamriel, and through great hardship, they eventually reached a large wall of ice where a young woman demanded that Veloth swear on oath before she would allow them entrance to their new home. Veloth threw his great hammer down and declared that his life would be dedicated to his people. Upon hearing this, the woman melted the ice so that before Veloth's followers lay the land now known as Morrowind. It was called Resdain in those days, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll only be giving up one name for these things. Upon seeing Morrowind, Veloth shed a single tear. That tear crystallized and became a holy relic imbued with powers of restoration and health. Within Morrowind, the Chimer built themselves a new nation founded on Daedric principles. The Chimeri culture flourished in what would be known as the Golden Age, wherein their religious worship of the Daedra would no longer be secret. Mighty temples to the Daedra were constructed, and Veloth went on to plant various seeds he had brought with him from the Somerset Isles. After his eventual death, Veloth became a celebrated figure whose lasting influence was felt in many centuries to come. But in those coming centuries, there would be little of celebration, for the Chimeri Golden Age was eventually brought to an end by the Dwemer. The Dwemer had established themselves in Morrowind as well, and the two cultures had been at odds for a long time. Their multiple conflicts were the result of their religious differences, with the Dwemer favoring logic as opposed to the Daedric beliefs of the Chimer. The eventual religious war between the two cultures saw the technologically superior Dwemer bringing the Chimer culture to ruins. The Dwemer then took Morrowind for themselves, but this was not to last either. This quick recap of Veloth's life is important to the greater discussion we'll be having a little later on, because Veloth's life and the establishment of the Chimer in Morrowind serves as the bedrock upon which the Nerevarine Prophecy will be founded. Many centuries after the Dwemer-Chimeri War of Old in the Third Era, an Outlander to Morrowind who was born on a certain day to uncertain parents came to Morrowind, and after a storm and strange dreams, the Outlander awoke on a boat docked in the small village of Saidanin on the south of the large Morrowind island region of Wardenfell. The Outlander had been released from prison at the behest of the very Emperor of Tamriel, seemingly just so they may arrive to Morrowind to join the Emperor's Blades, a spy organization whose purpose is the preservation and protection of both the Empire and the Emperor. The Outlander travels to Balmora and meets with Caius Cassadis, a grand spymaster of the Blades in Wardenfell, who inducts the Outlander into the Blades, then urges them to join some faction to gain more skills as well as learn more about the history of Morrowind. Cassadis then sets the Outlander on various quests to uncover the mysterious disappearances and revelations that the citizens of Wardenfell have experienced. Of particular interest are those that relate to the Sixth House and the Outlander prophecy of the Nerevarine. But before we can fully dive into that tale, I'm going to talk a bit about Morrowind itself. What the player may notice when they first leave from Saidanin to Balmora is the stark architectural differences of the two. Wardenfell is a cultural boiling pot stuck in the tangles of political overload, which is pretty great for this game's aspirations as an RPG. It allows the player a lot of freedom in how they want to interpret their characters outside of raw stats and character customization. Where they spend their time in this game is equally relevant to their development in it as whom they spend it with and what they spend their time doing. Morrowind started the Elder Scrolls tradition of segmenting the map by a great physical obstacle with story significance. In Skyrim this was done with the Throat of the World, and in Oblivion it was the Imperial City. Morrowind has the Red Mountain. The reason these games do this is because on paper it makes exploration take a bit longer, which means the team can get more use out of the map. Think about it this way. If the player could always walk in a straight line to their objective, there wouldn't be much need for the open world. By forcing them to open up the map and make a calculated decision on which road they want to take, the developers get the player to consider the world as a real place. Whilst traveling on their set road, they might meet and invest themselves in characters, enter dungeons, or even find great loot on dead bodies. Those side tangents make the world seem lived in as opposed to just being an obstacle to slow down progress. Something Morrowind does that I haven't seen much of in other games with the same design ethos is region variety. The island of Wardenfell is split into 9 specific regions, each with its own flora, fauna, geography, and climate. The 9 regions of Wardenfell are the Bitter Coast, the West Gash, the Sheogorad Region, the Grazelands, Azura's Coasts, Molag Amur, the Ascadian Isles, the Ashlands, and the Red Mountain. The Bitter Coast, also referred to as the Smuggler's Coast, is a swampland which houses Said Anim. Its copious amount of fog and the fact that it's mostly uninhabited, bar nix hounds and mushrooms, has made it into a hotspot for smuggling operations. If liquor taxes were lowered, surely the locals would be quicker to stomp down on their actions. The West Gash is to the north of the Bitter Coast and houses various trading villages such as Balmora, Caldera, and Gnesis. It has rich deposits of raw ebony in the rocky southern half, and on the more forested northern half it has fishing villages like Cool. It's one of the larger regions, so dangers are to be expected, though to a trained traveler, these serve as a mere nuisance. Occasionally, an ash storm may bring into the region a blighted creature or two, so it's advised to travel the roads armed for protection. The Sheogorad region is a collective of small and large islands to the north of Wardenfell. Its geography makes traveling through it by boat almost impossible, which has made the region politically unaligned. The islands mostly house threats like sorcerers, vampires, and bandits anyway, but there is a port village named Dagon Fell to the north. This village is home to many Nords. The Grazelands is a small region tucked to the northeast of Wardenfell. Though you might run into the occasional Daedra or Guar, it's a relatively peaceful region, characterized by its lush flora. Azura's Coast is the easternmost region of Wardenfell. It's firmly under the rule of House Telvanni, and therefore you're likely going to run into more than a handful of wizards in this region. Being under House Telvanni also restrains the influence of both the Empire and Tribunal in this region. Although there are various villages and towers in this region, it's mostly a desolate rocky affair with only the magnitude of islands and the occasional Daedra shrine to break this up. Molag Amur is to the south of the Grazelands and Ashlands, and although its geography is similar to the latter, it stands out by the abundance of lava pools and rivers scattering the surface. Molag Amur is an ugly and hostile region which is mostly untouched by any influential party since it is only ever crossed out of necessity. That becomes problematic for untested travelers because the region is fairly large in size and contains a very diverse and hostile fauna. The Ascadian Isles, which consist of the far south of Wardenfell, couldn't be more different from Molag Amur. They are a lush lowland filled with small farms and contains its fair share of villages which have themselves a fairly diverse architecture. All the way from the Imperial Epenhart to the Hlalu market town of Suran, from the Imperial fort town Peliajat to the holy city of Vivek, which houses the Tribunal himself, but more on him later. Separating most of the regions in Wardenfell, you have the Ashlands, which is a large circular wasteland. Though it has some permanent settlers, mainly in Aldru and Ursulaku and the Ghost Gate, it's mostly uninhabited as the all-too-common ash and blight storms make life hard on all but the toughest of life forms. This has also resulted in a small variety in vegetation, but a surprisingly varied fauna. The Ashlands are littered with Daedric and Dwemer ruins and completely encircle the Red Mountain. The Red Mountain is a volcano which sits in the dead center of Wardenfell, encircled by the massive magical wall called the Ghost Fence. The Ghost Fence was created and is sustained by the Tribunal in order to keep the blight and corpus-infested monsters contained. The Red Mountain is under control of the game's big baddie Dagoth and his cult, the Sixth House, which has taken many of the region's various Dwemer ruins as spaces of operation. The Red Mountain spat out the ash which gave the Ashlands its name, and is very much active. All in all, the world serves the goal of the developers. It supports the player's journey of growth in subtle but very effective ways. Different landscapes house different flora, and by giving vague directions, the characters make the player observe the world as a context-based puzzle. Then there are signposts which provide progress checkmarks that let the player open up their journal and reorient themselves, furthering their investment in Wardenfell as a real place. An additional layer to that magic is the weather. What I mean by that is that the weather has genuine mechanical ramifications. A storm can wreck the early game player, so when traveling, they need to weigh up their options before their journey and decide whether the shortest route may be too hazardous. Correct me if this assumption of mine is wrong, but I don't think it's out of the question to imagine that the weather was originally conceived of as a way to hide technical limitations. This obviously didn't wind up being the case, since the game can run each and every region weather-free, but it isn't hard to imagine the original intent if we consider how much of Wardenfell is covered in mountain terrain and the game's limited draw distance. I'm sure that the choice of Morrowind as a setting was no doubt inferred by the hardware the game would be running on. Launching on the original Xbox almost certainly made the team very conscious of what they could and could not get away with early on, so it must have forced the team to be very creative. Because of that limited draw distance, it's easier to forgive the map for being as unrealistically dense as it is. Limitations that spawn creative solutions to technical problems are just the best, and they're very ubiquitous in the best video games. Something else ubiquitous in the best games that Morrowind nails is something I like to call content fatigue. Players have a cap on their emotional investment, so a quality game has very conscious design choices when it comes to size. If all other elements are well balanced, then the question of size should really be a question of necessity, because eventually each new element slowly detracts from every other. An example of this in another game, this is why the individual quests of games like Skyrim are so tedious. They never give anything of substantial value to the emotional investment of the player because of how much content the game includes, and because most of that content is separated from the greater goal of the player. If instead the game had been scaled back and the effort had instead been to make more out of less, then the scale of value per element starts to work in the developer's favor. This is in no way a hard and fast thing, since, like all rules that aim to quantify artistry, it's a botched and mostly limiting idea, but if it's looked at as a general guideline without any larger meaning, then it can help inform other aspects of a game's critique. What I'm trying to get at is that there is such a thing as too much. For a single individual, a 5-star meal is better than a 4-star meal, but 3 5-star meals are not better than 1 5-star meal. An individual only has so much appetite, and it's not a good idea to ruin the first meal by letting them overindulge in the second two, because that's what's going to stick with them. Is my metaphor getting through? Content is great if it has value, but it is a monumental task to keep engagement going for more than 100 hours, whilst keeping play meaningful. For me, Morrowind achieved this. There's never a point where I was just walking around aimlessly without any drive or direction. I was never caught in a Skinner box loop because there was always something for me to do that tied to my larger objective in the world. Wardenfell is more than just hills and caves, it's something alive. The world in this game is something to struggle against, something to bond with, and something to master. Having discussed that, I want to pick up the story again by delving a little bit into the Nerevarine Prophecy. Sometime after being defeated by the Dwemer, but before the arrival of the Outlander, the then nomadic Chimer rebuilt themselves as a culture. This started out as mere clan allegiances, but eventually became the political power known as the Great Houses of Morrowind. It seemed that another golden age was afoot, but history has a tendency to repeat itself. The great obstacle for the Chimer this time were men who came to Morrowind from the northern Tamriel region of Skyrim. Their danger was in their dragon shouts, with which they aimed to carve themselves an empire. When these men arrived, it seemed to be the end of the Chimer, but a great Chimer warrior named Indoril Nerevar brought his people together, becoming their first Hortator, and with the supreme military powers that position granted him, began to fight back. Though Indoril Nerevar was a great warrior, it was not until an unlikely alliance with the Dwemer was struck that the men of Skyrim were pushed back. In defending their province, the Chimer under Indoril Nerevar and the Dwemer under Dumak Dwarf King found that they could live together and did so in peace for a long time. What formed from the Chimer-Dwemer alliance was the First Counsil of Rithdain, which resulted in unprecedented prosperity for both cultures. On the council sat the chosen leaders of both cultures, Nerevar and Dumak, and their friendship, already formed in combat, was only further solidified. But, as so often, conflict eventually emerged and the day came that this alliance broke. In the dead center of Wardenfell, in the great volcano the Red Mountain, the Dwemer discovered an immensely powerful artifact from the Dawn era known as the Heart of Lorkhan. Gameranx, the greatest mind of the Dwemer, began to study the heart that he may find out how his people might escape mortality and obtain their own godhood, but a friend of the great Nerevar, Vorin Dagoth, discovered Gameranx's research and informed his friend. A furious Nerevar demanded that Dumak Dwarf King explain himself, but Dumak was unaware of Gameranx's research and undoubtedly appalled by Nerevar's behavior. Vorin Dagoth convinced Nerevar that Dumak was lying and the Horde Hater's pride would not let this pass. For the second time, the Chimer and Dwemer went to war. The war's exact duration has been lost to time, but it did see Nerevar defeat his old friend Dumak in a great battle on the Red Mountain itself. Though the details of this monumental event in Tamriel history are muddy at best, it is well documented that it was in this war that Gameranx, using tools he had devised for channeling the heart's power, struck the heart of Lorkhan, and in an instant, the Dwemer were no more. Their remains were never uncovered, and their fate is a mystery that persists throughout the many ensuing eras of Tamriel history. The events that followed Gameranx striking the heart are as muddy as the fate of the Dwemer. It is known that Nerevar himself perished not long after this battle, but the exact details are lost to interpretation of ensuing events and might even have been deliberately hidden to hide a great act of treachery. Nerevar trusted the temporary conservation of Gameranx's tools to Vorin Dagoth and made his most trusted companions, later known in Tamriel history as the Tribunal, swear to never use the heart. On the good Daedra Azura they swore, and on Asura they lied. Vorin Dagoth, who had lost his mind to the power of the heart, decided that none of Nerevar's council could be trusted to keep the tools safe, which eventually resulted in a battle between himself, now calling himself Dagoth and Nerevar's three companions, the Tribunal to be Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek, and possibly even the mortally wounded Horde Hater himself. This battle was seemingly the end of Dagoth and if Nerevar had truly survived his battle with Dumak and fought Dagoth then it was the end of him as well. Nerevar's companion 3 all took one of the three tools and all broke their oath. When they used the tools and gained godhood from the heart, a furious Azura arrived, bringing with her divine fury for this treachery. But when the three Chimers showed no penitence, Azura cursed not only them three, but all Chimer, that their skin turn from an excellent gold to an ashen grey, and that their eyes turn as red as the mountain on which the three had broken their oath. Never again would the Chimer rule Morrowind, for no more would there be Chimer in all of Tamriel. Instead, they had been changed into the Dunmer. After delivering her divine punishment, Azura assured Nerevar's old companions that one day Nerevar would return, bringing with him his own punishment for their betrayal. Nerevar's three companions, now the Tribunal, led the Dunmer spiritual lives for centuries afterwards, even convincing the Dunmer that the three good Daedra had been nothing more than placeholders until their arrival. Whenever word reaches the militant temple of the Tribunal of a returned Nerevar, they are quick to silence those rumors. It seems strange that they would fear Nerevar's return, for if they had truly been destined to lead the Dunmer as they claim, Nerevar would have nothing to punish them for. But, in addition to breaking their oath to him and bringing Azura's wrath on all Chimer, it is spoken in hushed words that Nerevar did not die of his wounds in the Red Mountain, but rather that he was slain by the Tribunal themselves, so that they could acquire the godliness from the heart of Lorkhan. Whatever the truth is, has long ago been lost to interpretation. The Nerevarine Prophecy ascertains to the reincarnation of Indoril Nerevar and, without getting ahead of myself, Let's just say that the Outlander in the Third Era was not pardoned by the Emperor merely to serve as a spy. But before I can delve into the later half of the game, I have to discuss the intricacies of the former half. In the opening, the game got around to presenting the basics of interactions whilst also priming the player, setting up expectations for an experience which through effort they'd shatter. The expectations, that is, not the experience. The game teaches movement, dialogue, and the inventory, and then sends the player on their merry way from Seidanin to Balmora, expecting them to have the brains to figure the path out. They were given vague instructions and made to search for landmarks, which, as I discussed earlier, makes them read the map as a context-based puzzle. Since the overworld is dangerous early on and the player is underpowered, they must move slowly through the world, taking calculated routes which lets them take the world in early on. Since the player is so underpowered early on, exploration becomes a goal. Something players might do to speed up their trek from Seidanin to Balmora is use fast travel. This is something I called Bethesda out on in my analysis on A Link to the Past, and I feel it's only fair that I admit my error. What Morrowind does, which A Link to the Past did as well, is present a lot of these progression-aiding mechanics as in-game phenomena. Fast travel in Morrowind is handled by Siltstriders, teleportation spells, and boats. The great things about them being presented as in-game phenomena is that they merge mechanical mastery with immersion. This adds a richness to the otherwise mundane task which is almost essential for a game that aims to cover as large a story as Morrowind does. Morrowind does a consistently good job of presenting its mechanics in-world, which is great when the experience is paced as a 20 to 200 hour journey. It means the player must only master the nuances of the world to master the nuances of the game. Mastering those nuances is almost essential for anyone who wants to have any luck in the later game, which is why it's so essential that Morrowind does a good job of creating gradual growth in the early game. Tutorials are presented in-world and become available to the player by progress should they seek them out. That is to say, when the player is playing and realizes that they might want a healing spell, they're going to search it out, and in doing so, they open up new avenues for the immersive fantasy. Something the opening of the game does really well in general is priming. The character customization is a quick introduction to the various cultures of Tamriel, whilst also introducing the player to the stats and the mythos interwoven with it. Many attacks influence the player's stats, and it gets the player to internalize those stats, deepening their immersion as they understand their character on more levels, as well as giving the world more scope, since, again, even climate presents its own challenge. The combat in the early game is another example of priming the player. It starts out being clunky and imprecise, which makes the Outlander feel like an individual out of their depth. It's only when they get involved in the game's various factions and start to take on jobs that they become more adept at handling the numerous dangers in Wartenfell. The factions themselves are a great implementation. If playing the game for role-playing purposes, the factions are numerous and varied enough that the player's character will likely have a natural tendency towards one of them. That means that the factions allow the player an easy access level to the role-playing fantasy, whilst providing depth to the story and furthering the newbie's understanding of character interactions in this game. In essence, the factions offer easy entry levels into defining the player's character and what their interpretation of the world is going to be, which adds an additional layer to the immersion since the factions all interpret history differently and even have different names for events, people, and cultures. I've seen many ideas on expanding Morrowind, but through the lens of Immersion Driven Fantasy with an emphasis on freedom, the few that make sense are the ones that expand on the factions. This goes back to what I was discussing in regards to content fatigue. Additional geography does not make the game larger, but an additional guild would. More land lets the player do things in more places, but an additional guild lets them reinterpret the geography already presented and do new meaningful things in it. The one thing I found missing from Morrowind was a dedicated hunting guild. Implementing the hunting guild would require some additional fauna, which to be fair might not have been what 2002 era Bethesda wanted to make. The function of this guild would ideally be to diversify the player's knowledge of the Daedric Princess and create some cash flow and skill in the early game. The player would accept contracts to deliver pelts or clear out farms and mines of dangers. The actual act of hunting animals would teach strategy to positioning in combat and give the archery class and sneak some additional use. It would encourage exploration, and it would tie in nicely with looting plants for alchemy, and might play off the Outlander tribes by being an offshoot of Dunmer who left to follow the teachings of a different Daedric prince. That way, it might even open up new avenues to interact with the staple anarchy that is the Morrowind political scene, as the hunting guild player might even be looked down on by the great houses or imperials. The point of discussing a theoretical guild is to, again, stress what's at the core of Morrowind. It's about immersing the player in an engrossing world where expression is value. This is relevant to this discussion because so many people claim to want larger maps and more items, more stories from subsequent games, when they should be asking for a more interwoven fantasy. Morrowind is not a good game because it's sat on a big map. It's a good game because of how well the events that occur on that map collide. This actually goes a lot deeper than just the story. Almost everything in Morrowind ties together. The story places an emphasis on the geography, which gets the player to reinterpret it through the eyes of the various cultures from which the story comes from. The exploration yields immersive elements like alchemy, dungeon crawling, and escorts, whilst never betraying the greater goal of the game, because the main goal of the main quest is to encourage the player to get lost in the intricacies of the world. The player's closest contact in the early half of the main quest is Caius Cosades. His role is to guide them through the game until they're ready to tackle it themselves, which, like the monomyth mentor, is when he leaves. Morrowind has some neat ideas on characters in general. Since the character's purpose is as realized as it is, and since they themselves are as realized as they are, they help immerse the player in the micromechanics of story progression. Their mechanical depth makes the player internalize them on a deeper level, and they might actually start empathizing with them as they become more accustomed to discussing with them. The dialogue system the player uses is itself designed like a Wikipedia article. The player starts talking and there'll be some words highlighted in color in case they want further explanation on what those words pertain to. It helps the other characters speak in context of the world's lore, whilst giving the player the info they need without betraying their character's role as an outsider. This might actually be the reason Bethesda made the player an outsider. It's not pretty to look at, but for a game so focused on immersion and deep lore, it plays a lot better than, say, voice acting would. Since characters have affiliations with each other and like and dislike various factions, it makes the story seem like it's been going on for a longer time than the player's been around, which sells how realized the world is. The characters make the story take shape, and since they don't move from their locations, it helps sell the player on the idea that they are the adventurer. It might not be realistic that a person stays in the same place for 24 hours a day, but it does reinforce the game's goals. Each character feels like they belong in the story. They are well realized and make the story more personal. It's one thing to get story from a constantly updating quest log, and another entirely to receive it from characters you have to interact with. By making the player interact with them, the game also accomplishes world building. Each character has their own opinions and affiliations. They worship separate deities and interpret history differently, which helps give a grander scope to the world. The characters will give quests that have the player enter various caves or fortresses. The characters will start out by describing in vague terms where the area is, and that makes the player read the world as an outlander to this island, rather than as a checklist to be completed. The great thing about the journal as questlog in Morrowind is how quickly it gets flooded. Instantly, the player comes to accept the fact that they are never going to complete all of it, and it echoes how the game is all about sculpting your own adventure, leaving out what doesn't support your fantasy. Then, just when you think the characters have finally exhausted their use, the game has another trick up its sleeve. The characters solidify the experience. Sometimes, the player will have to convince a bad apple to leave town, and the immediate answer is to kill them, but an alternative is to bribe them. If, however, the player has become respected in that character's culture, they might just leave if the player asks nicely. Engaging the characters makes the game more epic and grounded at the same time, and helps sell both the freedom and immersive aspects of the game. The characters and their attitudes towards the player evolve as the story progresses, and that helps immerse them in the world, since it makes it seem alive, but it also has them think of the world in terms of the character they're playing as. Another way the game uses characters to solidify the experience, to immerse the player into their avatar and read the game on its own terms, is to have characters that can train the player in various skills. This has the benefit of deepening the characters, since it's not hard to imagine that these are the skills they're most prevalent at. It's immersive to seek out characters by remembering what they know, and it's rewarding to reach a stage of untrainability, the point where the player has become better than them at the skill, which also helps immerse the player in the fantasy of being the Nerevarine. Speaking of which, in the Third Era, the tribunal control over Morrowind is shaky because of the presence of the Empire, and because much of their collective power has been lost in fighting back the influence of a revived Dagoth-Ur and his cult, the Sixth House. Dagoth-Ur's power grows every year, and he spreads horrific diseases with the ash that comes from the Red Mountain, as well as tries to influence people in their dreams. The Tribunal have long ago accepted their ineptitude as battling his legions with force, so they decided instead to build the Ghost Fence, the massive wall which encircles the Red Mountain, to contain the horrors that Dagoth-Ur has created, as well as Dagoth-Ur himself. However, since the heart of Lorkhan is within the Ghost Fence, they can no longer use its powers to restore their divinity. Because of this, the fate of the Dunmer, and in fact all of Tamriel, is in jeopardy. In the ensuing centuries after the passing of Imperial Nerevar, the Dunmer culture has been split between the Tribunal worshippers and the nomadic Dunmer, who stubbornly refrain from abandoning the Three Good Daedra. These Aslanders speak of the Nerevarine Prophecy that says that one day, an Outlander will arrive to Morrowind and, fulfilling the 7 trials, will reveal him or herself to be the reincarnated Imperial Nerevar. This Outlander must have been born on a certain day to uncertain parents and then be immune to Corpus disease, the divine illness created by Dagoth-Ur. It was the fact that the Outlander had to fill the first trial of the prophecy that they were set free by the Emperor, so that they could possibly complete the later trials, reveal themselves to be Nerevar incarnate, and save Tamriel from Dagoth-Ur. After fulfilling the first 2 trials, the Outlander's third task is to find the Moon and Star, a symbolic ring worn by Imperial Nerevar himself, which is stated to kill anyone besides Nerevar who would try to wear it. The Outlander proves to be exempt from this curse, and in doing so, proves to be the reincarnated Hortator Imperial Nerevar. They then rally the great houses of Wartenfell to fight Dagoth-Ur, and in doing so, obtain the title of Hortator. Afterwards, they become accepted as the Nerevarine by the various Aslander tribes and the Tribunal Temple itself. The Nerevarine then meets with the God King Tribunal Vivek, who discusses the assault on Red Mountain and presents the Nerevarine with the Wraith Guard, one of Gameranx's legendary tools. Before confronting Dagoth-Ur, the Nerevarine must gather the other 2 tools, Keening and Sunder, which are held by Ash Vampire priests of Dagoth-Ur. Then, before their final engagement, Dagoth-Ur and the Nerevarine share some words and reflect together on the events that led to this moment. The fight between the 2 commences and sees the Nerevarine destroy the heart of Lorkhan, and in doing so, removing Dagoth-Ur's immortality and slaying him. This act also severed the Tribunal connection to the heart and ensured that the immortality they gained by betraying Nerevar would be no more. When the heart of Lorkhan is destroyed, the Red Mountain is cleared of blight, and Dagoth-Ur's cult, the Sixth House, falls. The Nerevarine is then greeted by Azura, who unleashes them from her age-old prophecy. I am going to go deeper into that prophecy and the theological ramification it contains, but first, I want to discuss the Outlander Nerevarine. The player's avatar in the game is customizable, but to the uninitiated, the character creation process can be rather daunting. This is because it's drenched in internal lore and logic, subtly priming the player for the experience whilst at the same time allowing them an avenue for expression. The avatar's role is whatever the player wants it to be. There's actually no one forcing them to fulfill the Nerevarine Prophecy, and here's a pretty unique thing about this game. Whether or not the player partakes of the set road, the game works. If they want to fulfill the Nerevarine Prophecy, then there are stories and mechanics in place to help them indulge in that fantasy. But if they just want to dive for pearls, there are also systems in place for that fantasy to be as engrossing as it can be. If they want to become a zealot follower of the Tribunal Temple, then they can go to the Aslands and slaughter the Aslanders, or they can just be a traveling adventurer, escorting people through the dangerous lands and occasionally helping out some out-of-luck farmers. If you've played a Bethesda game in the last 2 generations, then you'll have a good idea how Morrowind plays, but what sets Morrowind apart from the other games is how well balanced all these mechanics are and how well they feed into each other and the game as a whole. People often complain about how combat is handled in the early game, but by making the player such a clumsy oaf, the developer can set them off for a rewarding sense of accomplishment in the later game when every one of their strikes hit because they've had to earn their skill. This is true of every level and every step of the player's progression. The player's affiliation in the guilds is a result of their loyalty towards them and their associations with characters. It's a completely different game in the beginning than in the middle, since the player started out having to pawn their weapons to use the Silt Strider, but end up rich enough that they can buy their way into high esteem in people's eyes. Then, if they fulfill the Nerevarine Prophecy, in the end the player is so highly regarded for being the Nerevarine that they don't even need to throw money around. The player has an arc in Morrowind that's represented by more than just their physical location. Every interaction the player has with the world is in some way altered. They run faster, they can walk on water, teleport, and even fly if they want to. Instead of spamming the quick save in battle while slowly finishing up their cheap health potions, they can just one-hit every enemy from a distance. Instead of looting each and every flower to perform alchemy, they just purchase 600 ingredients and make up the loss by selling a few of the potions they made from those ingredients at the incredible prices they're able to negotiate. The only thing universally shared amongst all players is that their character will have an arc. They will grow and develop. Since almost everything increases some level, a single play session is sure to yield at least one level up screen. These screens are rewarding to look at, but they also have some text which echoes the player's journey. It's not a massive implementation, but it helps tie play to a greater goal and is a continuous reminder of the player's place in the world. I'm touching on this a lot, so I'll go into a bit more detail. The interactive elements of the game always tie into other elements of the overall experience. By that I mean that interacting yields avenues for immersion. Take the books of the game for an example. The developer got the player to immerse themselves in the world by offering them an easy level by reading certain books. This might not necessarily get them to actually read, since the books only need to be opened for the level to unlock, but it does get the player interested enough that they remember which books they've read and which they haven't. They at least know when they see them which books are the generic ones they've seen 100 times before, because they've seen them 100 times before. Another example of tying the overall package together is in the spellcrafting. People often complain about it and how it's broken, which it is, but since it does its job of making the player reinterpret combat engagements whilst at the same time reinforcing their investment in certain allegiances, characters, and furthering their understanding and mastery of the game's mechanics, it's a good implementation. The player does not have to abuse it if they don't want to, and since the game emphasizes freedom so much, they can just ignore the system or place a rule on the run where they won't use it if they think the spell they're making is unfair. I like to prattle on about win and failure states in games, so you might think I dislike how the game implements saves. The player can save at any point in the game, and while I don't think this should be true of every game, it makes perfect sense for Morrowind. Since the game is about immersing oneself in one's own fantasy, the quick saves add a leniency to the consequences of one's actions. I understand the argument for the game to be more stern, but since we know what the game set out to accomplish, we know that allowing resets is better because it gives the player some additional control over their experience. Of course, No one is going to jump to a save point they made 5 hours ago because it would lose them way too much of their character's growth, but there are times when the player destroys their affiliations with certain characters without having planned to, and oftentimes they'll just accidentally hit someone they like in the face. Those are the times when allowing the player to manually quick save every 5 or so minutes can save a 50-hour run. Could you imagine ruining your character after 50 hours of play and how incredibly frustrating that would be? To close out my discussion on the main character, the game's main quest is the story of a reincarnation of a legendary warrior, and it's made more believable when everything is earned. The player starts the game using the Silt Strider, but at the end, they're whipping out various teleportation scrolls or levitating their way to their destination. The gradual unveiling of the story parallels the gradual mastery of the mechanics, and it's a great symbiotic relationship. This symbiosis is at the very core of Morrowind. Everything bleeds into everything else, so the work is sustained by the interwoven nature of its inner workings. With that out of the way, let's dig into the prophecy. The prophecy pertains to 7 trials that the Nerevarine must complete. Just quickly, these 7 trials are that on a certain day to uncertain parents the incarnate moon and star will be reborn, that neither blight nor age can harm them, the curse of flesh before them flies, that in caverns dark where Azura's eye sees, she will make to shine the moon and star, that the stranger's voice will unite the houses so that 3 halls call them Hortator, that a stranger's hand unites the Velothi, so that 4 tribes call them Nerevarine, that they will honor the blood of the tribe unmourned, they will eat their sins and be reborn, and finally, that their mercy frees the cursed false gods, binds the broken, and redeems the mad. I started this video by discussing the monomyth. That was by design. See, what we like to interpret as fate and patterns is all too often mere coincidence. I really like the theological ramifications of the Nerevarine Prophecy and how it's presented in the game, because maybe the player is the Nerevarine, maybe not. Nobody forces their hand, they're free to indulge in whatever fantasy they set for themselves, but if they want to become the Nerevarine, they can by great effort. Being born to uncertain parents on a certain day is easily explained by chance. Being immune to the ravages of blight and AIDS comes about by taking an experimental cure. It's important to mention that it does in fact not cure the player of either, it just hides the destructive effects. Acquiring Nerevar's old ring, the one that's said to kill all who may wield it but Nerevar himself, then being approved by the Daedric Prince Azura as the Nerevarine seems to seal the deal, but remember that the player did in fact not need to solve the riddle of the ring's location themselves. The riddle aims to grant the ring only to those who are one with the land, but the player can solve it simply by asking the Outlanders for help. Being able to wield a ring that kills all but Nerevar isn't such a big deal when you realize the multitude of in-game explanations that the curse can be given. Maybe the destructive effects don't activate because the ring doesn't have any soul charge. Or maybe because it doesn't actually kill anyone. It's all hearsay. Maybe those that tried to wield it previously died naturally from injuries sustained on their journey. Maybe they too weren't all that immune to disease. Uniting the great houses and being recognized as Hortator is in theory a monumental task, but the actual act has less to do with being accepted as a hero and more to do with the player allying themselves with the right people and making underhanded deals. By killing the opposition, the player grants certain families more power, and in exchange, those families give the player a title that's pretty much been meaningless since the days of Indoril Nerevar. Being recognized by the Velothi as the Nerevarine isn't any more glamorous than becoming Hortator. It involves purchasing a slave and marrying her off to a tribal leader by tricking him into believing that she's royalty. It's not as hard as you might think to become accepted as the savior of a nomadic people who have for centuries prayed for a savior. Learning the history of Nerevar is easy, and honoring the tribe unmourned is done by killing Dagoth and freeing the Sixth House, as well as avenging the Dwemer who perished by Vorin Dagoth's manipulation of Induril Nerevar. Then finally, freeing the false gods is in the natural course of killing Dagoth Without destroying the heart that granted them immortality, the player cannot kill Dagoth so the two go hand in hand. The later ramifications of the Nerevarines' actions are the fall of the Tribunal, as well as their temple and the re-emergence of the worship of the three good Daedra. The Tribunal betrayal in the Red Mountain is punished by history, which will forever see them as manipulating fakers. But if that's not revenge enough, rest assured that by the game's end, it is very much possible to see all three Tribunal dead. What I like about Morrowind's handling of prophecy is how it falls right in line with the design ethos of the game and how it places value on effort over entitlement. If the player wants to fulfill the prophecy, then they must put in the hours to become the Nerevarine. It's not enough that they were born under the right circumstances, they must conquer the dangers of Wardenfell. They must rise in skill and overcome obstacles. They will make many bad decisions and likely kill more than one innocent person for the sake of convenience. But that actually makes the prophecy more realistic in a sense, doesn't it? Of course, to outsiders, it just seems that the player was made for the purpose of fulfilling the prophecy, but that's because the outsiders aren't witnessing the minute-to-minute struggle. Spending 5 hours in combat just to become adept at it, then spending 10 hours interacting with characters, 20 hours reading texts of lore, and 40 hours traveling makes a lot of sense and is very rewarding when it's for a larger goal. Fulfilling the Nerevarine Prophecy is so very rewarding because it takes effort. The player can't really half-ass it. Oh, and making that effort worth it? Rewarding the player for putting in the hours to master every nuance of the game is something I have rarely seen done as well as in Morrowind. Morrowind achieves what few games dare to attempt. I said earlier that there was something special I'd like to see the industry learn from it going forwards, and here it is. I think it'd be advantageous for video games as a growing medium to not shy away from making the player internalize the game. That satisfactory feeling after defeating Dagoth would never have come if the game had included waypoints or regenerating health. Elements that detract from the internalization and streamline the experience shouldn't be included if the goal of the game relates to internalization and deep immersion. Whenever there's a system that stands out, before simplifying it, developers ought to see if it's possible to make it inform the world, and if so, never be afraid to make the player internalize it. Believe me, as long as the player plays the game on its own terms, and as long as the game itself is well made, this is a winning mantra. If Morrowind had lessened itself out of fear that the barrier for entry was too high, neither I nor anyone else would be discussing it. Because Morrowind is content to immerse the player in all aspects, it resonates incredibly well. I could probably draw you a map of Wardenfell with special attention paid to character locations, their questlines, their affiliations with other characters and items. I might even be able to give you an extremely specific guide to the merchants of Wardenfell and what wares they push. All of these things I can do from one playthrough because Morrowind had the guts to be a better game. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and want more people to see it, be sure to like and comment, as interaction is what seems to set the YouTube filter these days. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, I'd recommend checking out the other retro analyses on my channel, and while you're there, be sure to subscribe for more content like this in the future. I'm also on Patreon in case you want to kick in $1 or $2 to help fix the leaks of this sinking ship. That's all that promotional stuff out of the way. I want to give special thanks to the good people of the Morrowind and role-playing games subreddits, as well as express my appreciation of, and apologies to, Bethesda. I was wrong when I insinuated that their game systems exist in a vacuum, or whatever I said back in the innocent days of last October. If you're thinking about diving into Morrowind but feel that its barrier for entry is too high, I would recommend you check out both my footage suppliers for this video and what graphical improvements they used. The footage was supplied by Voss and the Morrowind Modding showcases. Voss supplied me with the raw moment-to-moment gameplay, whilst the Morrowind Modding showcases supplied me with the aerial shots. Both of these will be linked in the description box below. Finally, Be sure to let me know what game you'd like to see covered next. I was thinking of maybe covering Grim Fandango, but RagnarRox, the great man, has already made a perfect video on that game, so I'm open to anything. Any platform, just don't pick anything that's gonna take me another 300 hours to finish. Oh, and pre-2000s. Promise I'll stick to it this time. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care, friend.